we're all set.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to the April 2022 meeting of the Harbor and Coastal Zone Management Commission for the Village of Mamaroneck. We are available on our usual Zoom stream on our YouTube channel and on LMC TV. Can I get a motion to open the meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Meeting's open. This evening, folks, we have only administrative items. We don't have any applicant items, but we have three, and they may take up some time. The first of which is the communication from the state on the Mamaroneck boat and motor application to replace a damaged bulkhead. We were contacted by the Department of State, Donna Morelli, who is the designated staffer at state to work with us. Jack and I worked on a letter back explaining, as we do, to the state how they should view our consistency process so that they could deal with the applicant on it in the first instance. Since this is for consistency purposes with state agencies, the state is final, but for a private applicant, it doesn't work that way, and the state can evaluate like we do, and we don't get to vote on how they enforce our policies, but we do get to guide them. But then the application also comes before us. The applicant understands that we're the permitting authority for this, and so does the state, because it's a marine structure. But because it's a good practice to be complete with the state in our communications, we took some care to walk through the policies that were affected and what we generally require in a similar kind of application. Everybody saw the letter that went out. We got a communication back. Ms. Morelli from Department of State told the applicant that there were really three policies in play. As to 44, our wetlands protection policy, the state, having looked at their application, their promise to use best practices, their indication that they will use silt netting in areas with no vegetation, no visible vegetation at the bottom, they're satisfied there's not going to be any adverse impact. We have on the landward side, certainly, and often for underwater, we have often required an opinion for that. We can decide whether we want to do that when the applicant's before us, but I don't, speaking for myself, I don't see a need to make the state ask for things that we can enforce ourselves. On our visual policy, the view shed policy, the state felt like by saying that they were going to use similar materials and build essentially the same bulkhead in the same place, and it's not quite in kind in place, but it's pretty close, that they had satisfied that because it won't look different, and leaving only really policy 13, which is that for erosion protection features, our LWRP specifically requires that an artificial erosion protection feature do its job for 30 years. So we took that up specifically in the letter, and they said about that, that you applicant must go before Harbor Coastal, because they're the permitting authority, and you must show that as part of your application. And they wanted to know from us if we felt like they had discharged their job in reviewing consistency the way we would. I'll open it for discussion. Yeah, I'll open it for discussion. Thoughts?
Seems like they were pretty responsive.
Yeah, thank you, whoever said that. All I was going to ask is this a typical kind of response from them? Because it sounds like it was pretty thorough.
Yes, I've talked to her, especially in connection with the Boston Post Road Bridge, where ultimately for reasons, some of which are very technical, having to do with the way the process went, like procedural, they signed off on the state's plan as written, but there was a lot of back and forth, and the state did put in a lot of information. The construction folks did put in a lot of information to satisfy state and us that they weren't doing anything that we wouldn't approve of, and they weren't causing any worse flooding. This particular staffer, I've been impressed with the degree to which she is willing to listen to how we do things and why we do them the way we do, and make sure that when she tells applicants what's needed from them, she's thinking about it the way we would like her to. I've been pretty happy with that. My view of this is that they took it seriously. They told the applicant what the applicant has to do, and this is just the applicant's on point. Without prejudging how we're going to vote it, because everybody can ask questions and have their own opinion. The application pretty much addressed everything that we would need to know about it, and the state has I think fairly conveyed our thinking about the relevant policies and what we need to know. There's a couple items outstanding, but nothing that an applicant can't readily provide to us. I think the state has discharged their obligation. Okay, and unless somebody disagrees, I'll convey to the state that they've discharged their obligation. They're good on consistency. They can go ahead and sign off. And now that we've seen the application, hopefully it will speed our review when it comes before us for the marine structure permit. I would always like to get these applications moved through the process as quickly and efficiently as possible. I think that's best for good governance and for the applicants. The second administrative item, we have not formally been involved in the harbor side of the Army Corps of Engineers project, but we were copied on correspondence about about changes to the harbor as a result of the Army Corps project. The harbor master may have some concerns, since we're going to be the permitting authority, and we're going to be both a consistency authority and a permitting authority for marine structures. The sooner we learn about what's going to come before us, I think the better. We're going to need somebody to really understand and report back to us on the harbor master's concerns. I'm going to look for a volunteer on this one. I think this is a working committee of one, but this probably involves just sitting by phone or in person, sitting down with the harbor master, looking at the plan, and figuring out, essentially so that we can understand and see whether we agree with the concern that's been raised, and probably at some point advocating for it. We're going to have to first understand what's proposed. Second, look at our LWRP, particularly the early policies, the ones about use of the harbor and the economic impact, the recreational impact, usage impacts. Third, our harbor plan, and think about and fourth, alternatives, and think about what we want to do. Somebody needs to do the deep dive before reporting back to the commission. And it doesn't have to be, it's any time before the next meeting. So I think we've got a little bit of lead time on that.
I don't mind volunteering.
That'd be awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Brittany-
Do you
Brittany
mind
can
sending
get
me
you
an
with the harbor
email?
master.
Yeah. If you could just send me an email with with your criteria you want me to make sure to hit on. I'm fine with that.
Absolutely. You'll figure this all out, and then we'll all sort of learn about it with you, and that way we'll be up to speed on it when we have to make any decisions on it.
Okay.
The last thing on our administrative agenda is the planning board comments on the wetlands law. I don't know about anybody else. I find long pieces of legislation difficult. There's 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 a lot, and there's a lot of details, and every time you think you've got everything to agree, you find out that you didn't, and you have to change some things around. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at the comments?
I was reviewing them this afternoon. And I agree with what you were just saying.
I think there are a lot of these things that are simply drafting, right? Some of these are just give it a scrub. And then there's the big picture conceptual. We fundamentally, I think, have a different point of view from planning about what's the most efficient place to have the wetlands review power reposed. We voted that we think it works better to have it with us because there are a lot of things that come up only on a wetlands issue, and they would come before us for consistency anyway, that are seeing two boards when they only really need to see one. And reasonable people can differ, and Chair Saville is a long-serving public servant for whom I have the greatest respect. But there are some things that are just differences of views, and some things that are drafting that can be cleaned up. That's going to be a bunch of work. I would love to. We can't work group larger than 3 because 4 is a quorum. I would love to split this 3 ways to go through and scrub. I certainly don't want to do it alone. Jack, Randy, can I get extra pairs of hands with this?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Great. Now we have been consistently on the trustee. Ultimately, this is a recommendation of the trustees about what to pass. But I think we want to hand them the cleanest document possible, and much of this can be taken out of play. However, it's going to take us some time. We are, I think, in theory, up again on Monday the 25th for the work session. I have no belief that I can turn something around that they're ready for in the next 5 days. I think we should ask, what do we need? 45 days to have all comments integrated? That makes sense to me, Jack. I see you're nodding. I think we need 45 days to be able to get through it. We can split it 3 ways, go through it, compare as a work group, and then be able to bring it back before, hopefully back before the commission, and then onto the trustees. That sounds reasonable, but making the next work session just is not going to happen. Okay, so I will ask the trustees to give to kick it down the road 45 days so that we've had an opportunity to integrate all comments. If folks want to talk about any of the stuff that's been raised by either attorney comments or planning board, we can do that. This is an appropriate forum to do it. I think a lot of them are drafting. I don't particularly want to, I want to integrate them first before I have anything to say, but I don't want to stop anybody else. If anybody saw anything that they want to address in the comments, you could do that now. And hearing none. Okay, I think that's our last administrative item. These are 3 significantly meaty things, but some of them simply need to be workshopped. 2 of them simply need to be workshopped. So that's all I have for our agenda tonight. I don't think we have any other issues. Any other new business?
Just, Thomas, how do you want to go about organizing the review?
I figure we can do it by sections. Where a lot of it's going to be in the first instance, just looking at it, figuring out how to draft around their problem or fix it. So we can just split it into sections. I'll take a look at it and make a proposal by email.
Okay, great. That's a good way to do it.
Great. Okay. Then we have no other business to discuss. We may or may not have an applicant back in front of us for the meeting. And with that, I think we can all sign off for the evening. Motion to close the meeting.
So moved.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We're closed. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brittany,
Good night.
thanks for
Thank you.
getting me.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.